The stagecoach bucked one last time, its worn leather straps groaning a final complaint before settling into the silence of exhaustion. Nora Hart pressed her cheek against the hot glass of the window, the fine red dust of the Arizona Territory coating the pane like a film of rust. Outside, Dry Creek announced itself not with a sign, but with a bleached cattle skull staring blindly from the base of a crooked mesquite tree. The year was 1876, and this was to be her new home. A relentless wind, hot as a furnace breath, swept down from the barren hills, carrying with it the taste of grit and the faint, metallic scent of silver. The town was a collection of raw timber buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, unforgiving emptiness that surrounded it. It was a place that felt temporary, a desperate foothold in a land that did not want it there. As she stepped down, her boots sinking into the deep dust of the main street, Nora felt the weight of the sun on her shoulders. The air was thin and shimmered with heat, making the distant Sierra Ancha Mountains tremble like a mirage. The medical station, attached to the postal office, was her destination. It smelled of carbolic acid, old linen, and the low, persistent hum of human suffering. Dr. Whitcomb, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary lines, greeted her with a grunt and a nod toward a cot. On it lay a boy, no older than 17, his face pale and slick with sweat under a mop of blonde hair. His hand was a mangled ruin of flesh and bone, crushed in a mining cart accident. This was the rhythm of Dry Creek. Men went into the earth seeking silver, and the earth, more often than not, demanded a piece of them in return. The cots were rarely empty. Miners with broken limbs, lung sickness from the dust, or fevers from drinking at the wrong water hole filled the small space. There were also men with wounds from conflicts that were spoken of only in low whispers after the second glass of whiskey at the saloon. Arguments over claims, cards, or the wrong look could end with a flash of steel or a bark of gunfire. And then there were the other stories, the ones that coiled in the air like smoke. They were stories of the ND, the people the townsfolk called Apache. The whispers named them savages, ghosts who swept down from the hills to steal water from the town's well, the very lifeblood of Dry Creek. They spoke of a fearsome leader, a phantom they called the Apache King, who led these raids with brutal cunning. The talk painted a picture of a relentless, faceless enemy responsible for every hardship the desert threw at them, especially the dwindling water supply. Nora listened, her hands busy cleaning wounds and changing dressings. She had learned long ago that fear was a liar, and the fear in Dry Creek was as thick and choking as the silver dust that settled on everything. Late one afternoon, 2 men carried in another miner, a young man with a chest wound. He was bleeding badly, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Dr. Whitcomb was out on a call, leaving Nora to manage alone. She worked with a focused calm that was her shield in such moments. She cut away his shirt, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The bullet had gone clean through his side, missing anything vital by a miracle of inches. "Stray shot," one of the men mumbled, twisting the brim of his hat. "Up near the pass. We heard nothing. Just saw him fall." As Nora cleaned the exit wound, her forceps clinked against something hard lodged in the man's leather belt. She carefully worked it free. It was a brass shell casing, still warm. She held it in her palm, her brow furrowed. It was a military-issue cartridge, the kind used in the new rifles the Army favored. It was not the sort of ammunition an Apache warrior, said to be armed with old muskets and arrows, would possess. She tucked it quietly into the pocket of her apron, a small, cold piece of a puzzle she did not yet understand. The official story of Dry Creek had just developed a crack. A few days later, the heat seemed to have baked all the moisture from the air. The line of people waiting at the town well was longer than usual, their faces etched with anxiety. The water level was dropping, and Marshal O'Rourke had posted a notice limiting each family's share. Inside the infirmary, Nora was organizing jars of herbs when the door opened, letting in a blinding slice of afternoon sun. A man and a little girl stood silhouetted against the light. As her eyes adjusted, Nora saw he was a Mexican man of middle years, his face kind but etched with a deep weariness. He held the hand of a small girl, perhaps 10 years old, whose dark eyes were wide and clouded with fever. She was wrapped in a thin blanket despite the searing heat, and she trembled. "Pardon, señorita," the man said, his English soft and accented. "We need medicine for the fever." "Of course," Nora said, stepping forward. "Bring her in. Let me see." The girl, whose name he said was Nadai, or Little Star in English, was burning with heat. Her breathing was shallow. Nora recognized the signs of a lung infection, likely brought on by bad water. As she prepared a poultice and measured out a dose of quinine, the man introduced himself as Miguel Ortega. He explained he served as a translator, a bridge between the town and the Apache who lived in the hills. Little Star was his friend's child. They had come a long way. Just as Nora was handing the medicine to Miguel, the door flew open again, crashing against the interior wall. A large man with a sunburnt face and a thick, drooping mustache filled the doorway. He wore a dusty hat and a badge that marked him as part of the town's volunteer posse. Behind him stood 2 more men, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. "Ortega," the man boomed. His name was Ezekiel Brandt, and he led the town's armed citizens group with a zeal that often tipped into outright cruelty. "What's this bringing filth into town now?" Miguel straightened, his hand moving protectively to Little Star's shoulder. "Senor Brandt, the child is sick. We only came for medicine." "Medicine?" Brandt sneered, his eyes sweeping over the girl with contempt. "Or are you here to spy on our well for your thieving friends, to see how much is left to steal?" Little Star whimpered and pressed herself against Miguel's leg. The fear in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Nora felt a cold anger rise within her. She had seen bullies like Brandt before, men who dressed their hatred in the clothes of civic duty. "She is a sick child," Nora said, her voice quiet but firm. It cut through Brandt's bluster. "And this is a place of healing. You will lower your voice." Brandt turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you, the doctor's new girl? You do well to learn how things are done here. We don't coddle redskins." "I am a medical assistant," Nora replied, stepping forward so that she stood squarely between Brandt's men and Miguel and Little Star. It was not a grand gesture, just a simple shift of her body, but it drew a line in the dust of the floorboards. "My only concern is for my patient. She has her medicine. Now, if you would be so kind as to let them leave in peace." Brandt chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "They ain't going nowhere. We're going to ask them a few questions about some missing water." He reached out, his hand like a slab of raw meat, intending to grab Miguel's arm. Without thinking, Nora moved. She placed her hand on Brandt's forearm. Her touch was not forceful, but it was firm and unexpected. It stopped him cold. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, his expression a mixture of surprise and fury. "You will not touch them," she said. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice did not waver. "Not in here. This is not your saloon, and it is not your jail. This is a sanctuary for the sick. Now get out." For a long moment, nobody moved. The 2 men behind Brandt shifted uncomfortably. The raw power of Nora's conviction held them all in a state of suspended animation. She was not armed. She was not large or imposing. But her defense of the small, feverish child was absolute, a moral wall he had not expected to run into. In her eyes, Brandt saw not fear, but a profound and unshakable certainty that he was in the wrong. He finally pulled his arm back, a dark flush crawling up his neck. He spat on the floor. "Have it your way, missy," he snarled. "But when the wells run completely dry and these animals are the cause, the town will know who to blame. You and your bleeding heart." He turned and stormed out, his men trailing behind him like stray dogs. The tension in the room slowly bled away. leaving a silence that felt heavy and fragile. Miguel looked at Nora, his dark eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. He squeezed Little Star's shoulder gently. "Thank you, señorita," he whispered. "You were very brave." Nora simply nodded, her hand still trembling slightly from the confrontation. She looked at the small girl, who was peering up at her from behind Miguel's legs, her feverish gaze a mixture of fear and wonder. In that moment, Nora Hart knew she had done more than just arrive in Dry Creek. She had chosen a side. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving place, but she was discovering that the most dangerous territory was not the land itself, but the contested ground within the human heart. And on that ground, a battle had just begun. The dust from Nora's confrontation with Ezekiel Brandt had barely settled when a new kind of disturbance arrived in Dry Creek. It came in the form of a man named Caleb Rusk, who stepped off the morning stagecoach dressed in a fine wool suit that seemed to repel the heat and grime of the territory. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of unshakable confidence. He claimed to be a representative of the railroad and silver mining interests. And that evening, from the porch of the saloon, he sold the townsfolk a beautiful, shimmering dream. He spoke of progress, of a steel artery that would connect their dusty outpost to the heart of the nation. He painted pictures of wealth, of ore carts filled with silver, of fresh water brought in by the trainload, of civilization taming the wild. His voice was smooth and persuasive, and his words were a balm on the raw nerves of a town stretched thin by drought and fear. He spoke of obstacles, of the need to clear the path for this glorious future, and when he spoke of the Apache, he did not use Brandt's crude slurs. Instead, he called them a regrettable impediment, a primitive holdover from a bygone era that must, for the greater good, be swept aside. The silver dust, he promised, would soon be replaced by gold coins in their pockets. The crowd, thirsty for hope, drank his words down. Within a week, the change was palpable. Marshall O'Rourke, a man whose authority was usually exercised in breaking up saloon brawls, suddenly found a new sense of purpose. He drew up a formal proclamation, sanctioned by Rusk's invisible but powerful employers, that severely restricted water access for any non-residents of the town. It was aimed squarely at the Apache. The document was posted next to the well, its official lettering a stark declaration that the town's fear had now become law. Sister Agnes found Nora late one afternoon, sitting on a bench outside the chapel, watching the long shadows of the saguaros stretch across the baked earth. The nun's presence was a small pool of calm in the simmering heat. "I heard what you did for the child," Sister Agnes said, her voice quiet. "It was a brave thing. Nora, a Christian thing." "It was the only thing to do," Nora replied, tracing a pattern in the dust with the toe of her boot. "Perhaps, but courage is a rare commodity here. Be careful. Men like Brandt and Rusk, they do not deal in compassion. They trade in fear and greed. They are building a cage of laws and lies around this town, and they will crush anyone who rattles the bars." She paused, her gaze steady and kind. "But do not let their darkness extinguish your light. The truth is a stubborn seed. It only needs one person to tend it." Her words were a comfort, a quiet affirmation that Nora was not entirely alone. A few days later, Miguel Ortega appeared at the infirmary again. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. He told her Little Star's fever had broken, thanks to the medicine. But others in the camp were now falling ill. The water from their spring was low and foul. He asked if Nora would be willing to bring another, larger supply of quinine and purifying agents. The risk was too great for him to bring another sick child into the town's hostile atmosphere. He proposed a meeting point, a small, hidden canyon at the edge of the foothills. It was a neutral place. He explained, a place where paths sometimes crossed. Nora agreed without hesitation. Her oath as a healer did not recognize the lines drawn by marshals or railroad men. The following afternoon, she packed the medicines into her saddlebags and rode out with Miguel. As they left the last dusty shacks of Dry Creek behind, the landscape opened up into a breathtaking, brutal panorama. The trail to the pass was narrow, winding through a canyon whose walls glittered with a fine, silvery dust that clung to their clothes and skin. It was beautiful in the dying light, a river of pale sparkles. But Nora knew it was the same dust that filled the miners' lungs and sent them to the infirmary's cots. It was the color of Rusk's promises beautiful and toxic. They reached the designated spot, a small grove of cottonwoods nestled between towering red rock formations. Miguel dismounted and placed the canvas bag of supplies near a flat, sun-warmed boulder. He whistled, a low, two-note call that was answered by a hawk circling high overhead. Then he stepped back, motioning for Nora to stay by the horses. They waited in silence. The desert was not truly quiet. There was the buzz of insects, the whisper of wind through the dry leaves, the distant cry of a coyote. Then Nora saw him. On a high ledge across the canyon, a man materialized from the rocks. He seemed not to have walked there, but to have grown from the stone itself. He was too far away to see clearly, but his silhouette was sharp against the darkening sky. He stood perfectly still, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was watching, not them, but the entire valley, his presence a silent claim over the land. Nora felt a strange catch in her breath. There was no menace in his stillness, but an immense, disciplined calm. He was a guardian, a watcher on the walls of his own world. Another figure, slighter and quicker, emerged from the shadows below, retrieved the medicine bag, and vanished as silently as he had appeared. The man on the ridge remained for a long moment, a statue of vigilance, before melting back into the landscape, becoming one with the rock and shadow. That was him, Miguel said softly, as they mounted their horses, the one they call the Apache King. His real name is Taza. Nora was silent for a long time as they rode. The image of the silent, watchful man was burned into her mind. He was not the savage phantom of the town's whispers. He was a protector. There was an order, a quiet dignity to his watchfulness that she found herself admiring. He was a leader defined not by noise and bluster, but by a powerful, disciplined silence. The sun had dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The sudden desert night was falling fast, bringing with it a surprising chill. They were riding through a narrow section of the pass, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. When the sound of shod hooves echoed from ahead, Ezekiel Brandt and two of his men blocked the path. Their faces, illuminated by the cold moonlight, were grim masks of malice. "Well, well," Brandt said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Look what we have here, the little medicine woman and her pet." Miguel's horse shifted nervously. "We are on our way back to town. Senor Brandt, let us pass." "I don't think so," Brandt said, nudging his horse closer. "You've been warned. Missy, warned to stay out of things that don't concern you. Seems you're a slow learner. Maybe a long walk home in the dark will help improve your memory." He gestured with his pistol toward her horse. "Get down." Nora's mind raced. They were trapped. The walls of the canyon were too steep to climb, and Brandt's men had them boxed in. This was not about justice or law. This was about punishment. It was about fear. Suddenly, from high on the canyon wall above them, a single sharp crack echoed through the pass. It was not a gunshot. It was the sound of rock striking rock. Brandt's horse screamed, rearing in terror as a shower of pebbles and small stones rained down, dislodged by a much larger boulder that had crashed somewhere unseen in the darkness above. The horse bolted, nearly throwing Brandt from the saddle. One of his men cursed as his own mount shied violently, slamming him against the canyon wall. In the ensuing chaos, another sound cut through the night, a low, sharp whistle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound that spoke of the wilderness, of predators and the hunt. The remaining horses, already spooked, became uncontrollable. The posse dissolved into a frantic scramble of cursing men and panicked animals. "Now!" Nora Miguel yelled, spurring his horse forward. He charged through the gap left by the flailing men. Nora followed without a second thought, her heart pounding. She leaned low over her horse's neck, urging it on, the wind whipping tears from her eyes. She didn't look back. She could hear Brant shouting curses into the darkness, but they were soon lost to the rhythm of her horse's galloping hooves. They did not slow until the lights of Dry Creek were a faint glow on the horizon. When they finally stopped, the horses heaving for breath, Nora looked back at the dark, imposing silhouette of the mountains. The pass was silent now. There had been no gunshots, no battle, just a sudden, precise application of chaos. It was an act of intervention, not aggression. It was disciplined. It was protective. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who had been watching from the darkness. The man the town called an enemy, the phantom they blamed for all their troubles, had just saved her from the town's self-appointed lawmen. Miguel looked at her, his expression grim but relieved in the moonlight. Some shadows in the desert are there to keep you safe. Nora nodded, her hands clenched tight on the reins. She was beginning to understand. In this land of harsh light and deep shadows, the lines between friend and foe, savage and civilized, were not drawn on any map. They were drawn by one's actions. And that night, in the glittering, toxic dust of the Silver Pass, a man of profound decency had proven he could be found on the far side of fear. The ambush in the pass left a lingering chill in Nora's thoughts, a cold counterpoint to the relentless daytime heat. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but disturbing shift occurred in the infirmary. It was no longer just the miners with broken bodies or the occasional gunshot wound that filled the cots. A persistent, low-grade sickness began to spread through Dry Creek. It was a stomach ailment, accompanied by fever and a profound weariness that settled deep in the bones. It affected the strong and the weak, the old and the young. The townspeople blamed the heat, the dust, the curse of a dry season. But Nora saw the pattern. The sickness was coming from the water. One morning, she went to the well herself, not for a drink, but to investigate. She lowered the wooden bucket into the depths, the rope scraping against the stone lining. When she pulled it up, the water looked clear enough, but as she leaned closer, she caught a faint, unnatural scent. It was a sharp, chemical odor, almost like tar, mixed with something acrid that reminded her of spent firecrackers. It was the smell of industry, not nature. Her mind immediately went to Caleb Rusk and his promises of progress. His crews were up in the hills, blasting a path for the railroad, their explosions echoing over the town at all hours. The truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. The blasting was leaching powder residue and chemicals into the underground water table, poisoning the well from its source. The Apache were not stealing the water. The railroad was poisoning it. She carried a sample in a sealed glass jar to Dr. Whitcomb. She set it on his desk and explained her theory, her voice low and urgent. The old doctor uncorked the jar and sniffed it cautiously. He swirled the water, held it up to the light, and his shoulders sagged. He could smell it, too. He sat down heavily in his chair, his face a mask of weary resignation. "It's possible." "Nora," he conceded, refusing to meet her eyes. "The blasting, it could disturb things in the ground." "Possible. It's the only explanation that makes sense." She insisted. "People are getting sick. We have to warn them. We have to tell Marshal O'Rourke." Dr. Whitcomb steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty window. "Telling the Marshal is one thing. Having him listen is another. Caleb Rusk has filled this town with promises. The Marshal, the saloon owner, the mercantile, they're all invested in his railroad. You go up against that. You're not just going up against a man, you're fighting a fever dream of wealth. It's a dangerous thing to try and wake a dreamer." Nora. His words were not a refusal, but a warning born of long, bitter experience. He was a good man, but a tired one. He had learned the hard way which battles he could not win. Disappointed but not deterred, Nora sought out Sister Agnes. She found her in the chapel, polishing the simple wooden cross on the altar. Nora explained her discovery. The scent in the water. The doctor's reluctance. The nun listened patiently, her hands never ceasing their steady, circular motion. When Nora had finished, Sister Agnes turned, her eyes clear and resolute. The 8th commandment tells us, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor," she said softly. The town bears false witness against the Apache to cover a greater sin. Your oath is to heal. Nora, poison is poison. Whether it comes from a snake's fang or a rich man's dynamite, you know what the truth is. You cannot unknow it. You must speak it. Her simple, unwavering faith was the anchor Nora needed. That afternoon, she wrote a clear, concise report. She detailed the rising number of patients with the same symptoms, the date she first noticed the odor in the well water, and her reasoned conclusion linking it to the railroad blasting. She did not mention the Apache. She dealt only in facts. She walked to the marshal's office, her report clutched in her hand. Marshal O'Rourke was leaning back in his chair, his boots propped on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. He listened to her with an expression of bored indulgence, as if she were a child telling a fanciful tale. He didn't even bother to look at her report. "Smells in the water," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Ma'am, it's 100 degrees in the shade. Everything smells. People get sick in the summer. As for the water, the only problem with that well is the Redskins drinking more than their share. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual town business to attend to." He turned his attention back to his knife. The interview clearly over, Nora walked out into the blinding sunlight, a cold fury burning in her chest. The law in Dry Creek was not just blind. It was a willing accomplice. Sister Agnes was right. She knew the truth, and she could not unknow it. If the town's law would not act, she would have to go above it. That night, by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, she rewrote her report. Adding a detailed account of Marshal O'Rourke's refusal to investigate, she wrote a separate, carefully worded letter addressed to the magistrate of the territorial court in the capital. She knew it was a long shot. The letter might get lost or ignored, but it was the only shot she had. Before dawn, she slipped out and gave the sealed envelope to the driver of the eastbound stagecoach, a man whose child she had treated for croup. He looked at her with understanding and tucked the letter safely inside his coat. Her secrecy was not as complete as she had hoped. That evening, as she walked the short distance from the infirmary to her rented room, a figure stepped out from the deep shadows of the alley between the blacksmith and the assayer's office. It was Ezekiel Brandt. He didn't touch her, but he blocked her path, his large frame filling the narrow space. The smell of whiskey and stale sweat radiated from him. "You're a busy little bee, ain't you?" he said, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "Writing letters, talking to folks you shouldn't. Some people might think you're trying to make trouble where it ain't wanted." Nora stood her ground, her medical bag held tight against her chest like a shield. "I am doing my duty as a healer, Mr. Brandt." "Your duty?" he sneered. "Your duty is to patch up minors and stay out of men's business. This town has a future, a rich future, and we won't let anyone, especially some do-gooder female with a bleeding heart for savages, get in the way of it. I'd be real careful about where you walk from now on. The desert has a way of swallowing up people who get lost." The threat was unmistakable, as cold and sharp as a knife in the dark. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped aside, letting her pass. Nora walked away, her legs unsteady, her back prickling with the feeling of his eyes on her. She did not run, but when she reached her room and had bolted the door, she leaned against it, her body trembling. Dr. Whitcomb's warning echoed in her ears. She had rattled the bars of the cage, and now its keepers were coming for her. She was not safe here anymore. There was only one person she could trust. She packed her bag with medical supplies and the few belongings that mattered, blew out her lamp, and slipped out a back window, keeping to the deepest shadows. She made her way to the small adobe house at the edge of town where Miguel Ortega lived. He opened the door to her quiet knock, his face immediately registering alarm at her presence and her frightened expression. She explained everything in a rush of whispered words: the poisoned water, the marshal's refusal, the letter to the court, and Brant's threat in the alley. Miguel listened, his expression growing grimmer with each word. "He will not let it go," Miguel said when she had finished. "Brant is a dog who enjoys the hunt. You cannot stay here. There is only one place you will be safe." He led her out into the moonless night. They moved like ghosts, avoiding the main roads, their path taking them across a vast, shimmering salt flat that crunched under their boots. The journey was long and silent, a desperate flight into the heart of the wilderness the town feared so much. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, they entered a narrow, hidden valley. Before them was the Apache camp. It was nothing like the wild, chaotic vision from the town's fearful imagination. It was a place of profound peace and order. Wickiups, shelters made of brush and hide, were arranged in a neat circle. A single, small fire burned at the center, its flames a warm, welcoming orange against the cool blues of the pre-dawn light. It was a community, a home. A man detached himself from the shadows near the fire and walked toward them. It was Taza. In the growing light, Nora could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall and lean, with a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a stone. His face was all sharp angles and thoughtful lines, his dark eyes holding a deep, assessing intelligence. There was no savagery here, only a powerful sense of dignity and command. Miguel spoke in a low, rapid mixture of Spanish and the Apache tongue. Taza listened, his gaze fixed on Miguel but clearly directed at Nora. He took in her dusty clothes, her medical bag, the exhaustion and fear that she could not hide from her face. When Miguel fell silent, Taza stood for a long moment, the silence stretching out, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then he gave a short, decisive nod. He looked directly at Nora. "You have spoken the truth," he said. His English was slow, the words carefully formed, but clear. "In my home, the truth is not a thing to be punished." He gestured with his hand toward the fire. "You are welcome here. You are safe." Nora looked from the calm, steady gaze of the man before her to the warm glow of the communal fire, the knot of fear that had been clenched in her stomach since the alley began to loosen. She had fled the law of Dry Creek only to find a deeper, more profound law in the heart of the desert. She had chosen her side, and in the home of the man they called an enemy, she had found sanctuary. The days in Taza's camp settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the quiet, purposeful movements of his people. Nora found a place for herself, a small corner of belonging earned through her quiet demeanor and her willingness to help. She assisted the women with grinding corn, learned to identify medicinal herbs that were different from her own, and tended to the small ailments of the camp. She saw Taza mostly from a distance. He was a constant, steady presence, moving through the camp not with the swagger of a king, but with the focused attention of a concerned older brother to all. He spoke little, but he saw everything. He organized the hunting parties, directed the reinforcement of the Hidden Valley's defenses, and spent long hours in council with the elders. Nora saw that his leadership was a heavy mantle, worn with a quiet grace that deepened her respect. Life was stripped to its essentials here: food, water, shelter, community. Yet the ever-present sun and the fine, red dust were relentless. They coated her skin, worked their way into her clothes, and seemed to settle in the very back of her throat. After a week, she longed for the simple, profound luxury of being truly clean. She had seen the women of the camp sometimes disappearing down a narrow, winding path that led away from the main settlement. One afternoon, when the sun was at its highest and the camp had settled into a sleepy, heat-induced lull, she decided to follow it. She carried a small piece of soap and a clean linen towel, a deep craving for solitude and cool water pulling her forward. The path opened into a secluded basin, a small, natural amphitheater of rock and sand. At its center was a well, older and more shallow than the one in Dry Creek. ringed by smooth, sun-bleached stones and shaded by a cluster of gnarled cottonwood trees. The air here was cooler, filled with the gentle rustle of leaves and the drowsy, rhythmic buzz of cicadas. The place felt secret, sacred. Believing herself to be completely alone, Nora unwrapped her towel, shed her dusty dress and underthings, and folded them neatly on a flat rock. The cool air on her skin was a blessing. She lowered a hide bucket into the well and poured the water over her head, the shock of it making her gasp. It was a baptism, washing away the grime of the past week, the fear of Brant's threats, the suffocating dust of the town. In the quiet solitude, feeling a freedom she had not realized she missed, she began to sing. It was not a conscious decision. The song simply rose from her, a simple, half-remembered folk melody from her childhood, a tune about a river and a willow tree. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper on the quiet air, a private expression of a moment's peace. She was soaping her hair, her eyes closed against the suds, when a sound made her freeze. It was the soft crunch of a boot on sand, a sound too deliberate for a stray animal. Her heart leaped into her throat. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. She was exposed, vulnerable. She crouched low behind the stone lip of the well, her arms crossed over herself, her mind racing with images of Brant's leering face. But it was not Brant. Through a gap in the cottonwood leaves, she saw Taza. He stood at the entrance to the basin, perfectly still, his back to her. He had obviously not expected to find anyone here. He had been walking the perimeter, checking the hidden paths into the valley, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The outline of his shoulders was tense. He had heard her, and he had stopped. A wave of hot, mortifying shame washed over Nora, even more powerful than her initial fear. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. She waited for him to leave, to give her back her privacy. But he did not. Instead, she heard another soft sound, the rustle of cloth. When she risked a glance, she saw that his deerskin shirt now lay on the edge of the well, just a few feet from her. He had placed it there, a silent offering of cover, and had already turned his back to her once more, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the rock basin. He had shielded her not with his body, but with an act of profound, immediate respect. Her trembling began to subside, replaced by a strange, fluttering warmth in her chest. She slowly reached out, her fingers touching the soft, worn deerskin. It was still warm from his body. She pulled the shirt on. It was large on her, falling to her knees, smelling faintly of wood smoke, leather, and the clean, dry scent of the desert itself. Covered, her dignity restored by this unexpected gesture, she found her voice. "Thank you," she said, the words barely a whisper. He did not turn around. "Keep the shirt," he said, his English slow and deliberate. "The desert does not forgive." His voice was a low, quiet rumble, devoid of any judgment or embarrassment. She clutched the front of the shirt, the reality of the situation settling upon her. You lost your shirt." For the first time, she heard a hint of something other than solemn duty in his voice, a low, quiet sound that might have been the start of a smile. "Lost a shirt," he said, still facing away from her, but found a singing heart. And then he was gone, melting back into the landscape as silently as he had appeared. Nora sat there for a long time, wrapped in the impossible softness of his shirt, her own heart beating a strange, new rhythm. The Apache king, the fearsome phantom of Dry Creek's imagination, had found her at her most vulnerable, and had answered not with aggression or dominance, but with a gesture of gentle, protective chivalry. He had seen her, and he had covered her. Intimacy, she realized, did not always begin with a touch. Sometimes, it began with an act of respect so pure it left you breathless. Later that week, the specter of the poisoned water followed her from Dry Creek into the hidden valley. Little Star. The child she had first protected at the infirmary fell ill. She was consumed by the same fever and stomach ailment that had plagued the town. Nora went to her wiki-up at once. Taza was there, kneeling beside the small pallet where the child lay, his face a mask of worry. He was not a distant leader now, but a kinsman, his concern for the small girl palpable in the quiet space. He watched Nora as she worked. He saw the gentle competence of her hands as she cooled the child's brow with a damp cloth, the focused way she listened to the girl's ragged breathing, the careful precision with which she measured out a dose of medicine from her bag. He saw not a frightened refugee, but a healer in her element. Nora, in turn, saw him not as a warrior or a chief, but as a man terrified of losing a child he loved. Their shared concern for Little Star became a new, unspoken bridge between them. "It is the water," Nora said to him quietly, after she had done all she could to make the child comfortable. "The spring you use. It must be fed by the same underground source as the town well. The poison has reached you, too." Taza's expression hardened. He had fought soldiers and settlers to protect his people, but this was an enemy he could not see, an invisible poison that crept into their homes and sickened their children. "We must find a clean source," Nora continued, her mind already working. "There might be another branch of the spring, higher up, before it joins the main flow. A place the contamination hasn't reached yet. If we could follow the watercourse, map its path from the mountain." He looked at her, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. She was not just offering comfort, she was offering a solution, a strategy. She was a partner in the fight. "I will take you," he said simply. The next day, they set out together, leaving the care of Little Star to her mother and the camp's own medicine woman. Taza led the way, moving through the harsh landscape with an easy, economical grace that Nora found herself admiring. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of the land, a line of greener brush indicating moisture deep underground, the type of rock that held water, the direction of the hidden flows. Nora, in turn, brought her own knowledge. She carried a small notebook and a piece of charcoal, and as they walked, she sketched a map. She drew the main canyon, the location of the camp's spring, and the path of the dry creek bed. It was a language he did not know, this world of lines and symbols on paper, but he understood its purpose. They worked in a comfortable silence, a team united by a shared goal. He would point, his long, lean finger indicating a feature of the landscape, and she would sketch, her hand moving quickly to capture the information. They found it late in the afternoon. Tucked away in a high, narrow ravine was a small, steady trickle of water seeping directly from a rock face, surrounded by maidenhair ferns and deep green moss. It was a place of impossible life in the middle of the dry rock. Nora tasted the water. It was cold, clean, and pure, with no trace of the chemical taint. It was a small victory, but in this parched land, it felt like a miracle. As the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the canyon, they sat for a moment by the tiny spring, the shared silence between them no longer a void, but a space filled with a new and growing trust. He had shown her his world, and she had helped him find a way to protect it. They were no longer simply a protector and the protected. They were allies. They were partners. And in the quiet heart of the Arizona desert, something fragile and beautiful had begun to take root. The discovery of the clean spring brought a fragile reprieve to the Apache camp, but the world outside their hidden valley was shrinking. The explosions from Caleb Rusk's railroad crews grew more frequent, more violent. The daily blasts were no longer distant rumbles, but concussive shocks that shook the very rock beneath their feet, sending dust clouds billowing into the sky and frightening the game from the hills. Rusk was a man in a hurry, and his impatience was being written upon the land with dynamite. His haste infected Dry Creek. Marshal O'Rourke, acting as Rusk's willing instrument, escalated his campaign of legal pressure. A new proclamation was nailed to the post beside the poisoned well. It declared a 50-yard perimeter around the well a restricted zone. Anyone found within that zone after dark, who was not a registered resident of the town, would be considered a trespasser and a water thief, subject to immediate arrest and punishment. It was a transparent trap, a legal cage baited with the very substance of life, designed for one purpose: to ensnare any Apache driven by thirst to approach the town. Miguel Ortega brought the news, his face grim. He had ridden out to the camp under the cover of a moonless night, the proclamation a stark warning he could not ignore. "It is a lie with a badge," he told Taza and Nora as they sat by the low fire. "They will post Brant's men in the shadows. They are hoping for a confrontation, something they can use as an excuse to bring in the army." "They will not find one," Taza said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "My people will not walk into their cage." "But others might," Miguel argued, his gaze troubled. "Travelers, other bands who do not know of the new law. And what of my own family in town, or Sister Agnes Brant's men are emboldened? They act as if they are the law now. I must go back. I must warn people to be careful." "It is too dangerous," Nora protested. "Brant is looking for any excuse. He will see you as a target." "That is why I must go," Miguel insisted, a stubborn set to his jaw. "To be a bridge, one must be willing to stand in the middle of the river, even when it floods. I will be careful. I will stick to the hidden paths." He left before dawn. The day passed in a state of tense quiet, every distant sound carrying a potential threat. Nora found it impossible to settle, her thoughts constantly turning to Miguel alone on the dangerous trails. Taza was gone, as well, having taken 2 of his best scouts to patrol the valley's outer rim, his silence a heavier presence than any words of worry could have been. They returned as the sun was bleeding its last red light across the western sky. Taza did not speak, but the urgency in his stride was enough. He came directly to Nora. "Miguel is hurt," he said, his voice clipped. "Brant's men shot him. He's hidden in the rocks near the survey line. Bring your bag. We must go now." There was no time for fear. Nora's training took over, a cool wave of purpose that washed away her anxiety. She grabbed her medical bag, her mind already cataloging its contents: carbolic acid, clean linen for bandages, probes, and forceps. This was no longer a matter of theory. It was a test of everything she knew. Taza led her and one other warrior, a man named Dasoda, through the rapidly falling darkness. They moved with a speed and silence that Nora found astonishing. Taza seemed to navigate the treacherous, rocky terrain by instinct, his feet finding purchase where she could see only shifting scree. He moved like a shadow, a part of the land itself. They found Miguel in a narrow, rock-strewn gully, not far from a series of wooden stakes driven into the ground, their tops painted white, the survey markers for the railroad. Sharp as daggers thrust into the heart of the desert. Miguel was conscious, propped against a boulder, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the faint starlight. He had been shot in the shoulder. "He said it was Apaches," Miguel whispered, his voice weak. "Brant. He shot me and then rode off, shouting that he was going for the marshal, that the savages had attacked him." "Save your strength," Nora commanded softly, already cutting away the bloody fabric of Miguel's shirt. Taza and Dasoda took up positions on the ridges of the gully, their rifles ready, their forms all but invisible against the dark rock. They were the guardians, creating a small, temporary sanctuary of safety in which Nora could work. The bullet had gone deep into the muscle of Miguel's shoulder. It had to come out. Nora built a tiny, shielded fire, just large enough to heat the tip of her probe in its flames. Her hands were steady. The world narrowed to the small circle of firelight, the pale skin of Miguel's shoulder, and the dark, ugly wound. She spoke to him in a low, calming murmur, telling him what she was doing as she cleaned the area and then began to probe for the bullet. Miguel gritted his teeth, his knuckles white where he gripped a piece of leather Taza had given him to bite down on. Finally, she felt the telltale scrape of metal on metal. "I have it," she breathed, carefully, using the forceps. She worked the piece of lead free. It came out with a sickening pull, followed by a fresh rush of blood. which she quickly stanched with a pressure bandage. She dropped the misshapen lump of lead into a small tin dish. It was then that she saw it. As the metal cooled, she wiped the blood away. It was not a rough, round ball from an old musket. It was conical, with distinctive grooves on its base. It was a modern bullet, a twin to the cartridge case she had found in the wounded miner's belt weeks ago. It was ammunition from a repeating rifle, the kind favored by Ezekiel Brandt and his posse. At that moment, a shout echoed from down the canyon, the sound bouncing off the high rock walls. "They're over here, I see their fire." Taza was beside her in an instant. "We must move, now." Nora worked frantically, packing the wound with clean linen and binding it tightly. Taza and DeSoto helped Miguel to his feet. He cried out in pain but managed to stand, leaning heavily on DeSoto. Gunshots erupted from the mouth of the gully, bullets ricocheting off the rocks with angry whines. Brandt had returned, not with the marshal, but with his entire posse. They were not here to enforce the law. They were a lynch mob. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Taza did not shout orders. He led with an absolute, disciplined calm that seemed to spread to the others. With a series of low whistles and sharp hand signals, he directed a retreat. It was not a panicked flight, but a tactical withdrawal. He and his men would fire a single, well-aimed shot from behind cover, forcing Brandt's men to duck. And in that brief moment of hesitation, the others would scramble another 20 yards up the gully. Nora, her bag slung over her shoulder, helped support Miguel, her body shielded by the rocks. She was terrified. The sound of the gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space, the air thick with the smell of black powder. But a strange, fierce resolve had taken hold of her. She would not let Miguel fall. She would not let these men win. She kept her focus on the next piece of cover, the next step, her movements sure and steady despite the trembling in her legs. Taza seemed to be everywhere at once. He guided them toward a narrow fissure in the rock wall, a path that was all but invisible in the dark. He was the last one through, laying down a final volley of covering fire before disappearing into the crack. They followed the twisting, narrow passage upwards, emerging onto a high, wind-swept ridge. Below them, they could see the lanterns of Brandt's men, milling about in confusion in the gully. They had vanished. The journey back to the hidden valley was a long, painful ordeal. They took turns carrying Miguel, who was fading in and out of consciousness. Nora walked beside him, monitoring his breathing, her hand pressed against the bandage to slow the bleeding. Taza scouted ahead, ensuring their path was safe, his vigilance absolute. They reached the safety of the camp just as the eastern sky was turning a pale, exhausted gray. They laid Miguel gently in Nora's wickiup, while the other women brought water and clean cloths. Nora unwrapped her small tin dish. She took out the bullet. It felt heavy in her palm, a small object that carried the weight of a great and terrible injustice. She cleaned it carefully and wrapped it in a piece of soft linen. Then she took out the small, worn journal where she recorded her medical notes. By the first light of dawn, her hand no longer trembling, she wrote down everything that had happened. She described Miguel's wound, the location near the railroad survey stakes, and the precise shape and markings of the bullet she had removed. Courage, she was learning, was not the absence of fear. It was the act of doing what was necessary in spite of it. And sometimes, the most courageous act was not to raise a rifle, but to pick up a pen and bear witness. She looked at the small, cloth-wrapped object on the table beside her. It was more than a bullet. It was a seed of truth, hard and undeniable. And she would protect it until it was time for it to be planted. A strange and watchful quiet settled over the hidden valley in the days following the attack on Miguel. It was the quiet of a held breath. Miguel was slowly, painstakingly recovering in Nora's wickiup. The bullet she had removed a constant, grim reminder of the violence that lay just beyond the canyon walls. His presence grounded the threat, made it real and personal for everyone in the camp. The women brought him broth. The children peeked in on him with wide, solemn eyes, and the men who stood watch on the high ridges did so with a new, sharper vigilance. The attack had not broken their spirit. It had forged it into something harder, more resolute. During this time, Nora and Taza existed in a shared space of unspoken understanding. They were partners in Miguel's care, a silent team moving with an easy familiarity around the sickbed. She would change the dressings, and he would be there with a basin of fresh, clean water from the high spring. She would measure out a dose of laudanum for the pain, and he would gently lift Miguel's head so he could drink. They spoke little, for there was little that needed to be said. Their communication had moved beyond the clumsy confines of language into the realm of shared purpose. One evening, after the camp had taken its meal and a profound stillness had fallen with the dusk, Nora stepped outside for a breath of cool night air. The sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo, and a sliver of a new moon hung low in the west, a delicate silver sickle in the vast darkness. The air was sweet with the scent of sage and the lingering smoke from the cook fires. It was a night of rare and fragile peace. She saw them near the central fire pit, where only a few embers now glowed. Taza was sitting on a smooth, flat rock, and Little Star was beside him, her small form leaning against his leg. The child had become Nora's shadow since her recovery, a bright, chattering presence who followed her everywhere. Seeing Nora, Little Star jumped up and ran to her, grabbing her hand. "Come," the child said in her mix of English and Apache. "Sit, we have corn cake." She pulled Nora toward the fire, pressing a small, still warm cake of baked cornmeal into her hand. Nora sat on a log near Taza, the child settling between them. A warm, living bridge. For a long while, they ate in a comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one from the deepening dark. "My mother," Nora said softly, the quiet of the night drawing the words from her. She had not intended to speak of it, but the memory was suddenly close, brought to the surface by the constant anxiety over the poisoned water. She died from a sickness of the water. We lived in a town back east, a factory town. The mills dumped their waste into the river, the same river we drew our drinking water from. People got sick, a slow, creeping sickness. The doctors didn't know what it was, or if they did, they were afraid to say. It took her in a season. Taza was silent, but he turned his head, his gaze steady on her in the dim light. He was listening, truly listening. "I was young," Nora continued, her voice a near whisper. "All I remember is feeling helpless, watching her fade, and knowing there was nothing I could do, nothing anyone would do. The mill was more important than the people. I suppose that's why I learned medicine. I never wanted to feel that helpless again." She finished her story and fell silent, a little embarrassed by her sudden confession. It felt like she had exposed a raw, private wound. Taza watched the glowing embers for a time before he spoke. "Last year," he began, his voice a low rumble. "Before the long heat, men came in the night. They did not come to fight. They came to steal. They took 12 of our horses, good horses. One was a mare, ready to foal." He paused, and in the silence, Nora could feel the depth of the loss. It was not about property. It was about life, about the future. They were not just animals to us. They were family. They carried us. They helped us hunt. We knew their spirits. The men who took them left tracks from army horses. They sold our family for a few dollars. We found one mare weeks later, dead in a canyon. They had run her until her heart gave out. He looked at Nora, his eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "We also know what it is to be helpless, to have something precious taken by men who see only profit, who do not understand the meaning of family." Their stories, born of different worlds, met in the quiet space between them. Two streams of sorrow flowing from the same bitter source. They were not so different. This Apache leader and this doctor's assistant, they had both learned the hard lesson that the world was full of men who would poison rivers and steal horses without a second thought for the lives they destroyed. Little Star, who had been listening with a child's solemn gravity, reached out and took both their hands, her small fingers linking them together. The simple, innocent gesture seemed to seal the unspoken understanding that had just passed between them. Nora looked at the child, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Little Star represented everything that was good and innocent, everything they were fighting to save from the poison and the greed. A cold thought, sharp as a shard of ice, slid into Nora's mind. What if something happened to her? What if Brant made good on his threat? Who would look out for this child? For these people she had come to care for so deeply, the old fear of loss, of abandonment, the ghost of her mother's sickbed, rose up to haunt her, as if he could read her thoughts. Taza's grip on Little Star's hand tightened. He looked at Nora, and his gaze was so direct, so penetrating, that she felt he could see straight into her soul. "If I fall," he said, his voice quiet but imbued with the weight of a sacred vow, "if the fight takes me, you will watch over her. You will keep her safe." It was not a question. It was a statement of profound trust. Nora's breath caught in her throat. He was entrusting her with the most precious thing in his world. He was giving her a place in his family, a responsibility that went deeper than blood. "Yes," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "And if anything should happen to me, you must do the same. You must protect her." "You are one of us now," he said. A simple declaration that settled all her fears. "We protect our own." He released Little Star's hand and his fingers found Nora's. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was a quiet, steady pressure, a current of strength and reassurance flowing from his hand to hers. His skin was warm and calloused, the hand of a warrior and a leader, and in its grasp, she felt an anchor in the swirling chaos of her life. They sat like that for a long moment, their hands joined, their promise hanging in the cool night air under the sliver of the new moon. Slowly, Taza leaned forward. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not pull away. She trusted him completely, but he did not kiss her on the lips. Instead, he gently, reverently, pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of immense tenderness and respect, an intimacy of the spirit, not the flesh. His breath was warm on her cheek. It was a kiss of shared souls, a sealing of their pact in a way that was more profound than any passionate embrace could ever be. When he drew back, his eyes held a soft warmth she had never seen there before. Little Star, who had watched this silent exchange with wide, knowing eyes, suddenly smiled. She looked at Nora, her small face glowing in the firelight. "Chitim hat," she said, the Apache word soft and melodic. Then she translated, pointing a small finger at Nora's chest. "Sister Singing Heart." The name echoed in the quiet valley. A perfect, unexpected grace note. It was a memory of a song whispered in solitude by a well, a moment of vulnerability that had been met not with shame, but with respect. Her secret self, the part of her that sang when it felt free, had been given a name. It was the name of who she was in this place, in this chosen family. Taza's mouth curved into a rare, genuine smile. It transformed his stoic face, lighting it from within. "Sister Singing Heart," he repeated softly, the name a perfect fit. Nora felt tears well in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of homecoming, love. She was beginning to understand. It was not a sudden, passionate storm. It was a quiet, steady thing, built of shared sorrows and small gestures of trust. It was the act of keeping a promise under a new moon, and it was the greatest sanctuary she had ever known. The promise made under the new moon was a brief, gentle pause in a world that was accelerating toward violence. The quiet was shattered not by a gunshot, but by a roar that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. It was Caleb Rusk's dynamite. But this was no ordinary blast. It was a cataclysm. The ground beneath the hidden valley bucked and heaved. A massive plume of red dust and black smoke billowed into the sky, obscuring the sun and casting a terrifying, premature twilight over the land. Birds screeched from the trees, and the horses screamed in their rope corral. This was the sound of a mountain being broken. In Dry Creek, the shockwave hit like a physical blow, rattling windows and sending a tremor through the floorboards of every building. A moment of stunned silence followed, and then a collective cry of alarm rose from the town. People poured out of the saloon and the mercantile, their faces turned toward the monstrous, churning cloud of dust in the hills, and then another sound began, a low, groaning, splintering noise from the center of the town. It was the well. The great timbers that framed its opening had cracked. The stone lining, shaken by the blast, gave way. With a final, sickening crash, the roof of the well collapsed inward, taking a wide section of the surrounding ground with it. The town's heart had caved in, where there had been a source of life. There was now a gaping, rubble-choked wound in the earth. The underground stream that fed it was blocked, silenced. Panic, raw and primal, ripped through the crowd. This was more than a disaster. It was a death sentence. The stored water barrels would not last a week in the searing heat. Caleb Rusk was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the rising tide of fear. "Sabotage!" he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger toward the hills. "It was the Apache. They couldn't steal our water, so they have destroyed it." It was a blatant, desperate lie, but it landed on the fertile ground of the town's ingrained fear. Marshal O'Rourke immediately took up the cry. "He's right. It's an act of war." Ezekiel Brandt shoved his way to the front of the crowd, his face a mask of righteous fury. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the perfect excuse to unleash the hatred he had so carefully cultivated. "An act of war demands a response," he roared. "Are we going to sit here and die of thirst while those savages celebrate in the hills? Or are we going to ride out there and teach them what happens when you strike at the heart of this town?" His words were a match to a powder keg. A mob mentality took hold, swift and terrible. Men ran for their rifles, their faces grim, their fear twisted into a thirst for vengeance. They were no longer individuals, but a single, angry beast. And Brandt was its voice. News of the approaching riders reached the Apache camp moments before they appeared at the mouth of the valley. A scout, breathless from his run, delivered the warning. Taza did not waste a second. There was no panic, only a quiet, disciplined explosion of activity. He sent the women, children, and elders, including the still recovering Miguel, deep into the narrow, hidden canyons at the back of the valley. Nora gathered her medical supplies, her promise to protect Little Star a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Taza gathered his warriors. They were few, perhaps 20 men against the 40 or more in Brandt's posse, but they had the land as their ally. "We do not meet them in the open," Taza said, his voice low and calm, cutting through the tension. "We do not fight their battle, we fight ours. We are the rock and the shadow. We are the echo in the canyon. We bleed them of their courage, not their blood. We protect our families. That is all. Go." The men melted into the landscape, becoming part of the terrain they knew so intimately. Brandt's posse rode into the valley with a confident, reckless clamor. They expected to find a camp to raid, a people to terrorize. Instead, they found an unnerving silence. The wickiups were empty. The central fire a cold circle of ash. The emptiness itself was a threat. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't aimed at a man. It struck a rock face high above the riders, sending a shower of stone chips down onto them. Another shot echoed from the opposite side of the canyon. The posse, unnerved, fired back wildly at the unseen enemy, their bullets wasted against the impassive rock. Taza's strategy was brutally effective. It was a battle of nerves. His men used their knowledge of the canyon to create diversions, to make their small numbers seem like a legion. A rock slide, skillfully triggered, blocked the posse's path of retreat. A volley of arrows would rain down on a section of the canyon, only for the shooters to have vanished by the time the townsmen turned to fire. The posse's confident charge devolved into a confused, frightened scramble. The men, mostly miners and storekeepers, were not warriors. They were out of their element, hunted by ghosts in a landscape that had become their enemy. In the midst of the chaos, the wounded earth gave another groan. A section of the canyon wall, destabilized by Rusk's initial, massive blast, sheared away in a secondary rock slide. It crashed down near a small group of Brant's men who had become separated from the main party. 2 men were caught, their legs pinned by heavy boulders, their screams of agony cutting through the gunfire. Ezekiel Brant saw it happen. He saw his men trapped, helpless. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with a curse, he spurred his horse on, abandoning them to their fate. His war was not about protecting his men, it was about extermination. But Taza also saw it. From his vantage point high above, he saw Brant's callous abandonment, and he saw the 2 trapped men. He gave a sharp bird call whistle. The shooting from his men ceased. In the sudden, ringing silence, Brant's remaining posse, thinking it a trick, hesitated and then began a full, panicked retreat, leaving their injured comrades behind. Then the impossible happened. One of the trapped men, looking up, saw figures moving on the ridge above. It was the Apache. He closed his eyes, preparing for the end. But the killing blow never came. Taza and 2 of his warriors slid down the scree slope, their rifles slung over their backs. They were not there to kill. They were there to help. The trapped men stared in disbelief as Taza assessed the rocks that pinned them. With a few quiet words in his own language, he directed his men, using fallen timber as levers. They began the arduous process of shifting the boulders. It was an act of incredible, dangerous mercy. They were completely exposed, yet they worked with a focused calm. They were not saving enemies. They were saving men. From a hidden alcove, Nora watched the scene unfold. She had refused to retreat with the others, insisting her place was here, where there would be wounded to treat. Seeing Taza's act of grace, a fierce, burning pride swelled in her chest. This was the man she had given her heart to, a leader who fought to protect life, all life, in the face of blind hatred. She knew then what she had to do. The battle for Dry Creek would not be won with bullets in this canyon. It had to be won with the truth. In the open, in the heart of the town. She made her way back to Dry Creek, taking a high, hidden path. She emerged from the alleyways into the main square to a scene of chaos. O'Rourke, standing on the saloon porch, was trying to spin the posse's humiliating retreat into a heroic victory. "They ran like the cowards they are," he was shouting to the anxious crowd. Brant and his men drove them deep into the hills. "That's a lie." The voice, clear and steady, cut through the marshal's bluster. All heads turned. Nora Hart walked into the center of the square, her face smudged with dust, her eyes blazing. She held up a small glass jar filled with the foul-smelling water from the well. The Apache did not destroy the well. "Marshal," she said, her voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. "They have been its victims, just like the rest of us. This well was poisoned weeks ago by the blasting from Caleb Rusk's railroad." A murmur went through the crowd. Rusk, standing beside O'Rourke, went pale. "This is nonsense," O'Rourke bellowed. "She's been living with them. Her mind has been twisted." "My mind is clearer than ever," Nora countered, her gaze unwavering. She held up her medical journal. "And my notes are even clearer. This book contains the name of every person in this town I have treated for the sickness caused by this poisoned water. It also contains this." She reached into her pocket and held up the small, misshapen bullet she had removed from Miguel Ortega's shoulder. 3 nights ago, Ezekiel Brant shot an unarmed man and left him for dead, claiming it was an Apache attack. This is the bullet I removed from that man. It was fired from one of Brant's own repeating rifles. I am a witness. The truth is a witness. Who are you going to believe? Marshal your own eyes and the evidence in my hand. or the lies of a man who pays you to look the other way. A stunned silence fell over the town square. The crowd was no longer a single, unified mob. It was a collection of individuals, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning doubt. They looked from the furious, sputtering marshal to the calm, resolute woman standing alone in the dust. They looked at the foul water in the jar and the grim piece of lead in her hand. The story of Dry Creek, the one they had been told and had chosen to believe, had just been ripped apart. The battle had come home. Nora's stand in the town square did not ignite a riot or a revolution. It did something far more dangerous to men like Rusk and O'Rourke. It planted a seed of doubt. The unified anger of the mob fractured, splintering into 100 different conversations, into murmurs of confusion and suspicion. The simple, ugly story of savage Apaches had been replaced by a complicated, messy one involving poisoned water and a framed man. And the town of Dry Creek did not know what to believe. The immediate result was a tense, sullen paralysis. The stalemate was broken 4 days later by the arrival of a dust-covered buckboard carrying a man who represented something Dry Creek had not seen in a very long time, an authority that could not be bought by the railroad and would not be cowed by a bully's posse. His name was Judge Isaac Morrison, a circuit magistrate for the Arizona Territory. He was a thin, tired-looking man with a fringe of gray hair and eyes that had seen too much sun and too many lies. He was not there by chance. Nora Hart's long-forgotten letter, sent weeks before, had finally found its way to his desk. Coupled with the stagecoach driver's wild tales of a town on the brink of war, it had been enough to divert him from his scheduled route. He did not set up court in the marshal's office or the saloon. He ordered a large canvas tent to be erected in the center of the square, the very spot where Nora had made her stand. It was an open-sided affair, a declaration that these proceedings would be held in the full, unforgiving light of day. A simple plank table served as his bench, with a few crates for the witnesses. It was a court of law stripped down to its barest essentials, a judge, the accused, and the truth, waiting to be heard. The entire town seemed to be there, a ring of anxious faces pressing in around the edges of the tent. Nora sat on a crate near the front. She was not wearing her usual dress. She wore the deerskin shirt Taza had given her. It was too large, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, but she wore it not as a costume but as a kind of armor. It was a quiet statement of allegiance, a shield of dignity that lent her a strength she did not know she possessed. Taza was there as well, though not inside the tent. He stood with a dozen of his men at the far edge of the square, near the mouth of the alley leading to the salt flats. They were not there as participants in this white man's justice. They were observers, a silent, watchful presence, ensuring that the story of their people would not be told with the lies this time. Taza's gaze met Nora's once across the dusty expanse, a brief, steady acknowledgement that held all the weight of their shared promise. The hearing began. Judge Morrison's voice was dry as dust, but it commanded attention. He called Nora Hart first. She walked to the witness crate, her medical journal in her hand. She did not speak with passion or anger. She spoke as a healer, as a woman of science. She read from her journal, her voice clear and even. She recited the dates, the names of the sick, the symptoms that were a common, poisoned thread running through the town's life. She presented the sealed jar of water, its foul, chemical scent now a matter of public record. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own fevers, their own children's stomach pains. Then came the testimony of Dr. Whitcomb. The old doctor walked to the stand slowly, his shoulders slumped, looking for a moment like a man on his way to the gallows. But when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly firm. He confirmed that Nora had brought her concerns to him. He confirmed that he, too, had smelled the chemical taint in the water. He admitted his own fear and reluctance to challenge Caleb Rusk's influence. It was a quiet, damning confession of a good man's cowardice, and in its honesty, it was more powerful than any accusation. Sister Agnes followed. She brought no scientific evidence. She brought her simple, meticulously kept ledger from the charity kitchen. She read the entries aloud. For the weeks preceding the well's collapse, she had distributed 3 times the normal amount of cornmeal and dried beans to the Apache families who came to her for help. They were not stealing water, she said, her voice gentle but unwavering as she looked at the judge. They were being starved of it. And when people are desperate, they will sometimes drink from poisoned wells, because it is a slower death than thirst. Her testimony painted a picture not just of contamination, but of deliberate, cruel coercion. Caleb Rusk sat beside his lawyer, his smooth confidence beginning to crack, a fine sheen of sweat on his upper lip. Marshal O'Rourke blustered and objected, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a single, icy glare. Then the judge called for Miguel Ortega. Miguel walked to the stand, his left arm bound in a clean white sling. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear and steady. He recounted the events of his ambush in the pass, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. He described how Brant had shot him, how he had openly bragged about blaming it on the Apache. "And do you have any proof of this accusation?" Mr. Ortega Rusk's lawyer asked with a sneer, "beyond the word of a known sympathizer?" "I do," Nora said, stepping forward at the judge's nod. She opened her linen-wrapped bundle and placed the misshapen piece of lead on the judge's table. "This is the bullet I removed from Mr. Ortega's shoulder. It is from a repeating rifle, not a musket or a bow." Brant, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, a contemptuous smirk on his face, suddenly went rigid. The smirk vanished. "A single bullet proves nothing," Rusk said loudly. "It could have come from anywhere." "Perhaps," Judge Morrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. He reached into a leather satchel beside him and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a letter, its creases worn from a long journey. But a letter sent weeks ago often proves a great deal. A letter from a Miss Nora Hart, detailing concerns about the water quality and the marshal's refusal to investigate. A letter which also details a private conversation she overheard, in which Mr. Rusk offered Marshal O'Rourke a significant cash bonus, to be paid upon the successful clearing of the Sierra Ancha Pass of all impediments. A collective gasp went through the crowd. O'Rourke leapt to his feet, his face purple. "That's a lie, a complete fabrication." "Is it?" the judge asked, his tired eyes now hard as flint, "because the letter goes on to name the specific bank in the territorial capital where the funds were to be deposited. An inquiry to that bank via telegraph this morning proved most illuminating. A large deposit was indeed made to your account, Marshal, from an account held by the Great Western Mining and Railroad Company." The structure of lies, so carefully built by Rusk, O'Rourke, and Brant, collapsed. It did not fall with a roar, but with a sickening, silent implosion. Rusk simply sat there, his face ashen, his lawyer suddenly finding the dust on his boots to be of immense interest. O'Rourke sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Brant just stared at Nora, his eyes burning with a pure, impotent hatred. Judge Morrison let the silence hang in the hot, dusty air for a full minute before he delivered his judgment. His words were precise, each one a hammer blow. First, all blasting and construction related to the railroad in the vicinity of Dry Creek was to cease immediately, pending a full geological survey by the territorial government. Second, all proclamations restricting access to water sources were declared null and void. The Apache people's historical right to access water in the Sierra Ancha was to be respected and protected by territorial law. Third, Ezekiel Brant was to be taken into custody immediately, to be tried for assault with a deadly weapon, the fabrication of evidence, and incitement of a violent mob. As 2 deputies the judge had brought with him moved to put Brant in irons, the big man finally broke. He lunged toward Nora, a wordless roar of fury tearing from his throat, but he never reached her. Taza and 2 of his men moved with the speed of striking snakes, stepping from the edge of the square to intercept him. They did not draw weapons. They simply formed a living wall. their bodies an immovable barrier of silent, disciplined strength. Brant pulled up short, faced with the very men he had terrorized, and the fight went out of him. The deputies snapped the manacles on his wrists. The judge was not finished. He looked at the slumped form of Marshal O'Rourke. "As for you, Marshal, you are suspended from your duties. You will remain in Dry Creek to answer charges of corruption and dereliction of duty." Caleb Rusk, the architect of it all, was the last to be addressed. "As for you, Mr. Rusk," the judge said, a note of deep distaste in his voice, "the evidence of bribery is compelling, but that is a matter for a higher court than this one. However, I am officially voiding your company's contract in this territory, effective immediately. Your dream of progress, it seems, has come to an end." The hearing was over. As Brant was led away in chains, his head bowed in defeat, a strange new feeling settled over Dry Creek. It was not joy. It was a profound, sober sense of consequence. They had been led to the brink of a terrible injustice, and had been pulled back not by a hero on a white horse, but by the quiet persistence of a woman who wrote things down, and by the unshakable dignity of the people they had tried so hard to hate. The crowd parted for Nora as she walked from the tent, their gazes a mixture of awe and shame. She walked to the edge of the square, to where Taza stood waiting. He looked not at the defeated men, but at her. "A promise is a heavy stone," he said, his voice low. "For her alone, you carried it well, Sister Singing Heart." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gave a short, sharp nod to his men, and they turned, without a backward glance at the town or its broken laws. They began the long walk back to their valley, their home. They moved with the quiet purpose of a people who had not won a victory, but had simply refused to be erased. The departure of Judge Morrison's buckboard left a vacuum in Dry Creek, a profound and unnerving quiet where the storm of accusation and judgment had just been. The truth had been laid bare, but the pieces of their broken community lay scattered in the dust. The well was a collapsed ruin, a monument to greed, and the fragile trust between the town and the people of the hills was a thing of memory. The air was thick with shame, uncertainty, and the ever-present, desperate need for water. It was Sister Agnes who took the first step. The day after the hearing, she walked out from her chapel carrying a pickaxe, its handle worn smooth from use. She walked to the edge of the collapsed well and, without a word, began to pry at the first of the heavy, splintered timbers. Her movements were small and seemingly futile against the scale of the destruction, but it was an act of faith, a refusal to surrender to despair. Soon, another figure joined her. It was Dr. Whitcomb, his face grim but resolute. He picked up a shovel. Then came the blacksmith, a man whose quiet strength was respected by all. And then his wife, one by one. Then in small groups, the townspeople emerged. They were hesitant, their faces etched with the memory of their own foolishness. But they came. They came because the work was necessary, and because the quiet labor was a kind of penance. They worked for 2 days, a sullen, almost silent crew, clearing the rubble, their efforts clumsy and disorganized. The task was immense. The main shaft was blocked by tons of rock and earth, the underground flow choked off completely. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the sun began to beat down with its full, merciless force, a new group of workers appeared at the edge of town. It was Taza, and with him were 20 of his men. They carried no rifles, only ropes, sturdy digging tools, and long-handled levers made of fire-hardened wood. They did not speak. They walked directly to the well and stood there, a silent, powerful presence, waiting. A wave of apprehension went through the townspeople. It was one thing to accept the truth of their innocence, another to stand shoulder to shoulder with men they had called savages only a week before. The blacksmith was the one who broke the silence. He wiped the sweat from his brow, looked at the immense boulder blocking the main shaft, then looked at the strong, lean men before him. He nodded once, a gesture of grudging respect for their skill and strength. "We could use the help," he said, his voice rough. That was all it took. The work resumed, but it was different now. The Apache moved with a quiet, coordinated efficiency that was both beautiful and humbling to watch. They understood leverage, balance, the breaking points of rock and timber. They worked as a single organism, communicating with slight gestures and low-spoken words in their own tongue. Taza directed them not with shouts, but with a calm, decisive presence. He was a leader in his element, and his element was the hard, unforgiving reality of the land. Slowly, painstakingly, a new community was forged in the dust and sweat around the ruined well. It was not a community of friends. It was a partnership born of shared desperation. The townspeople brought the brute force. The Apache brought the knowledge. Together, they began to heal the wound in the earth. As the work progressed, another change took root. Nora established a new medical station. She did not use the old infirmary, which still held the ghosts of fear and prejudice. Instead, she set up a large canvas tent under the shade of a massive, ancient green oak tree that stood on a small rise between the town and the path to the hills. It was neutral ground. The tree, a rare and resilient splash of deep green in the red landscape, was a symbol of endurance. Her first patients were the two men Taza had saved from the rock slide. They came to her with their wives, their gazes downcast, their gratitude a clumsy, unspoken thing. Then came the Apache women with their children, their fevers and coughs a lingering legacy of the poisoned water. Soon, miners with crushed hands were sitting on the same benches as Apache elders with aching joints. In the quiet shade of the oak tree, pain had only one language, and healing required only one kind of compassion. The old order continued to crumble. A new territorial marshal arrived, a stern, no-nonsense man who officially relieved O'Rourke of his duties and placed him under house arrest to await his trial. A few days later, a prison wagon came for Ezekiel Brandt. He was led from the town jail in chains, his face a mask of cold, unrepentant hatred. He did not look at anyone but Nora. His stare was a silent promise of future vengeance. Caleb Rusk was the last to leave. He departed on the stagecoach, his fine suit looking out of place, his briefcase of broken promises in his hand. He, too, stopped to look at Nora as she stood by her tent. His expression was not one of rage, but of cold calculation. He had lost this battle, his eyes said, but the war for the land and its riches was far from over. His departure left not a sense of victory, but a lingering chill, a reminder that the greed that had poisoned the well had not been vanquished, only temporarily displaced. That evening, after the work at the well had stopped for the day and a fragile peace had settled with the dusk, Taza came to Nora's tent. Little Star was with him, and she immediately ran into Nora's arms, chattering about a lizard she had seen. Nora held out a folded bundle of soft deerskin. "I wanted to return this," she said quietly. "Thank you." Taza looked at the shirt, then at her. He took it from her, but he did not put it on. Instead, he unfolded it and gently draped it back over her shoulders. The worn, soft leather was a familiar, comforting weight. "Keep it," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The desert is still unforgiving." She looked up at him, and in his dark eyes, she saw the reflection of the setting sun and something more, a deep, steady affection that needed no grand pronouncements. It was as real and enduring as the ancient oak tree that sheltered them. The lines of conflict and mistrust, of rescuer and rescued, had dissolved. They were simply a man and a woman, standing together against a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. "I will not leave. Taza," she whispered, the words a promise she had not known she was ready to make until that very moment. "Whatever comes next, I will be here." "I know," he said. He reached out and his hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a touch full of reverence and a quiet, certain knowledge. "Neither will I." He did not need to say more. The promise was sealed in that simple touch, in the shared understanding that had been forged in crisis and tempered in the slow, hard work of healing. Their love was like the green oak tree. Its roots sunk deep into the rocky, unforgiving soil. Its strength found not in ease, but in endurance. Little Star, oblivious to the quiet gravity of the moment, laughed with delight. She let go of Nora's hand and began to run in joyful circles around the wide but gnarled trunk of the great oak, her small form a whirlwind of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Her laughter was the sound of a future they had fought for, a future they would now build, together. The winter that followed was a season of quiet, difficult work. The truce between the town and the Apache was not a friendship, but a fragile, unspoken pact of mutual necessity. They finished reinforcing the well, their combined efforts creating something stronger and more durable than what had been there before. They dug a long, shallow irrigation ditch, lined with flat stones, that carried a managed flow from the now clean well water out to the parched land, a shared artery for a community learning to share a single heart. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the land began to respond. The year turned to 1877, and with it came a spring so tentative it was almost a whisper. A thin, determined fuzz of green appeared along the edges of the new ditch. Tiny, resilient wildflowers, purple and yellow, pushed their way through the hard-packed earth. For the first time since Nora had arrived, the desert did not look like it was dying. It looked like it was resting, gathering its strength. It was blooming. To mark this fragile new beginning, Nora and Taza decided to hold a small gathering. It was not a celebration with grand speeches, but a simple festival of the water. On a warm afternoon, with a gentle breeze stirring the new leaves on the great oak tree. The people came. The families from Dry Creek walked out from their dusty streets, their face scrubbed, their movements still hesitant and uncertain. The Apache families came down from their hidden valley, their bright clothing a vibrant splash of color against the red earth. They met at the ditch. At first, the two groups stood apart, separated by a chasm of memory and mistrust that was wider than the few feet of flowing water. Then Little Star, holding Nora's hand on one side and her mother's on the other, let go. With a fearless laugh, she kicked off her moccasins and waded into the shallow, cool water. She splashed her hands, sending a shower of sparkling droplets into the air. A boy from the town, the blacksmith's son, watched her for a moment, his own caution warring with a child's simple desire for play. Finally, he grinned, pulled off his boots, and jumped in after her. That broke the spell. Soon, a half-dozen children from both communities were in the water, their initial shyness forgotten in a joyous, chaotic water fight. Their laughter, pure and unburdened by the prejudices of their parents, was the first true language of this new peace. The adults watched, and on the weathered faces of miners and the stoic faces of Apache warriors, the hard lines began to soften. They were not yet friends, but they were neighbors, watching their children play in the water they had saved together. Miguel arrived midway through the afternoon. His arm was fully healed, and he carried himself with a new, quiet confidence. He found Nora and Taza near the oak tree and handed them a letter bearing an official territorial seal. It was a formal offer from the magistrate's office, appointing him the official government interpreter and liaison for the entire Sierra Ancha region. His bridge of words, once a brave and lonely outpost, was now a recognized part of the landscape. Later, Sister Agnes and Dr. Whitcomb walked over from the medical tent. The nun carried a freshly painted wooden sign in simple, clean black letters. It read, Dry Creek Community Medical Station. She hung it from a low-hanging branch of the oak tree, where everyone could see it. The sign did not belong to the town or the Apache. It belonged to everyone. Dr. Whitcomb then turned to Nora. He was carrying his old, scuffed leather medical bag. the one he had carried on his rounds for more than 30 years. He held it out to her. "My hands are not as steady as they once were," he said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotion. "And my heart is tired. This work, it requires a heart that is still willing to fight. It needs you, Nora." Nora took the bag, its worn leather warm from his touch. It was heavy with the tools of her trade, and heavier still with the weight of the trust it represented. Her journey was complete. She had come to Dry Creek as an assistant, a woman seeking a small place in the world. She now stood as its healer, a leader who had helped a broken community find its footing. As the sun began to sink toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows across the gathering, Taza's gaze lifted. He looked past the playing children, past the town, to the high, distant ridges that rimmed the valley. For a fraction of a second, he saw a flash of light, the telltale glint of the sun on a spyglass lens. It was there, and then it was gone. He said nothing. He did not want to spoil this fragile peace with a new fear, but the look in his eyes changed, a flicker of the old, watchful vigilance returning. The world was still full of men like Caleb Rusk. The snake had been driven from the garden, but it had not been killed. It was a sobering reminder that peace was not a destination. It was a garden that had to be tended, its borders constantly guarded. When the last of the families had begun to drift back toward their respective homes, their goodbyes quiet and a little shy, Taza took Nora's hand. They walked away from the great oak tree, their fingers intertwined, and stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. The air grew cool, and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. They did not speak of the future, of the dangers that might still be lurking on the horizon. They did not need to. Their promise to face it together was a silent, living thing between them. Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough deerskin of his shirt familiar and comforting against her cheek. She looked out at the land that was now her home, at the twinkling lights of the town and the dark, silent majesty of the hills. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling of having finally, truly arrived. She whispered the words that had started it all, the phrase that had been both a beginning and a prophecy. The Apache king found her singing naked by the well and lost his shirt, joining her heart. Taza looked down at her, and in the faint starlight, she could see the soft smile that touched his lips. It was a smile of deep contentment, of a love that had been tested by fire and found to be true. "A shirt can be replaced," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "A promise cannot." Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Please comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.